On December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota men were hung in Mankato, Minnesota after being convicted of rape, murder, and robbery. These hangings were a result of a long relationship between settlers and Dakota, a relationship full of mistrust, conflict, differences of culture, and broken treaties. An encounter was long overdue and tensions were high. Broken relationship caused the Dakota War of 1862, where two stories are told, one by the Dakota occupants and the other by the new settlers. This conflict would not be acknowledged until the late 20th century, and yet it had a profound impact on Minnesota's development. White settlers began to migrate westward due to extensive opportunities such as land ownership. The new settlers invaded the Dakota land, causing clash of cultures, broken treaties, and conflicts that contributed to a shattered relationship. The Dakota initially didn't understand the settlers' urge for land and money. For over 1,000 years, Minnesota land was sacred to Dakota. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson knew the Dakota would not voluntarily hand over their land, so he planned something to trick and force them into signing treaties. Thomas Jefferson states, "To promote this disposition to exchange lands, which they have to spare and we want, we shall push our trading houses and be glad to see the good and influential individuals among them run in debt, because we observe that when these debts get beyond what the individuals can pay, they become willing to lop them off by secession of lands." So a plan was devised to make the Dakota in debt, leaving them with no choice but to hand over their land. There were many deceptions involved. Luke Lee threatened the Dakota by stating the U.S. government could come with 100,000 men and drive you off to the Rocky Mountains. Henry Sibley understood the Dakota language and even had relations with a Dakota woman, producing a daughter. He was buried in debt and recognized a way to get out of it by lying to the Dakota about the content of the treaty. Sibley wrote to Pierre Chouteau, "The Indians are all prepared to make a treaty when we tell them to do so, and such a one as I may dictate." After the first treaty was signed, Henry Sibley took the chiefs to sign a second treaty. It was an agreement to hand over most of the payment from the land they sold to the traders, all but $60,000, but they did not know this. A key factor was left out. They would not get their money in a lump sum. Instead, it would be given in small annual payments. But the devastating reality was the payment wasn't just in money, it was in food and farming supplies. The Dakota had to rely on treaty payments for their survival, but none were coming. By summer 1862, most of the Dakota were starving. There is a current historic marker that reads, "Four young hunters on a spur of a moment dare proved their bravery by shooting a man. They stopped at his cabin and asked for liquor. They then went to another house and got into a target shooting contest, and suddenly the Indians turned on the settlers, shooting 3 men and 2 women to their death. They went back to their village and reported their encounter, and the Sioux chief decided to wage an all-out war against the white man." Monument states they decided to wage an all-out war as if nothing happened to lead up to such a big decision. The monument left out so much. Some stories state that 4 young men were starving and looking for food. There was no encounter where liquor was requested, and a target shooting contest did not occur. After the killing, the 4 boys went back to their chief and told him what they had done. A council was called. Little Crow, a chief of the Dakota, told them the white world would come down hard on all the Dakota, not just the 4 boys. Many said they should attack the settlers first based on all the broken treaties and mistreatment. Dakota that did not support the war actively helped and protected the white settlers. There were wrongs committed by both Dakotan settlers, but it is important to explain the settlers' faults because it is still being depicted as a war the Dakota started. The Dakota War of 1862 lasted 36 days. 400 to 900 settlers civilians were killed. 50 to 100 Dakota were killed. The war caused the settlers to panic and many fled western Minnesota. By 1863, the Dakota were forced to give up all their remaining land in Minnesota, and the U.S. government canceled all treaties made with them. Henry Sibley made it very vocal that he was determined to take out the Dakota by stating, "Tame the Indian, cultivate him, strive to Christianize him as you will. And the sight of blood will in an instant call out the savage, wolfish, devilish instincts in his race." This horrific statement came from a man who once lived peacefully among the Dakota. There was a group of 1,700 Dakota that consisted of young children, women, and old men who did not participate in any battles. Sibley wrote to these Dakota where he specifically said he would protect them if they came out with a flag of truce. The Dakota believed Sibley, but his word was not honored. Sibley forced the 1,700 Dakota to march 150 miles down the river. This came to be known as the Trail of Tears. The Dakota walked for a week before reaching their destination near St. Paul. It wasn't until spring of 1863 when they were transported to Crow Creek, South Dakota. Through this process, there were countless deaths. Keep in mind, these were the Dakota who opposed the war. They were not guilty of anything, but they still received this treatment. It got so severe that a newspaper columnist, Jane Grace Swisselm, offered to pay $75 for each Indian scalp. During the trial, almost 400 Dakota men were tried by military commission, and 303 were sentenced to death. As many as 42 Dakota were tried in one day. They didn't have lawyers, and some trials only lasted 5 minutes. President Lincoln was shocked by these numbers and reduced it to 38 Dakota men. On December 6th, Lincoln announced his decision to the Senate, anxious not to act with so much clemency as to encourage another outbreak, on the one hand, nor with so much severity as to be real cruelty on the other. The 38 Dakota men were hanged in Mankato. One man found guilty, Tazoo, states, "Tell our friends that we are being removed from this world. Over the same path they must shortly travel. We go first, but many of our friends may follow us in a short time. I expect to go directly to the abode of the Great Spirit and to be happy when I get there. But we are told that the road is long and the distance great." The execution of the 38 Dakota took place at 7:30 a.m. on December 26, 1862. 4,000 people came to watch the execution. The men had hoods pulled over their heads. They held hands and sang prayers as the boards below them dropped. Novels came out glorifying the hanging, and souvenirs were sold. Settlers were satisfied with the outcome. After the execution, there was still a need for revenge. Settlers shot Little Crow, and his scalp and wrist bones were displayed at the Minnesota Historical Society for decades. It has been over 150 years since the largest mass hanging in United States history, and yet it is rarely talked about. There are many reasons the encounter is not publicized, including that it happened during a time of inherent racism, misunderstanding of cultures, the government's wrongdoing, and Minnesota's denial towards its failures. But these concerns are not put to rest even yet today. In fact, Minnesota's capital contains unrealistic paintings of the Dakota War. By the Dakota knowing that their history is misrepresented, in Minnesota's capital, where the mass hanging occurred, Dakota are continually reminded of their unfair past and difficulties that may yet be faced in their future.